Back in Thompson. For those of you who were here, I think it was probably about 5 years ago now, time has flown. The project that I've undertaken is a retirement project, was just simply trying to figure out how my ancestors went from Cambridge on down to Hartford in 1636. So that was almost 9 years ago that I started. I kind of figured out how they did it, but I'm still trying to figure out what kept them going. I'm here tonight to give an update to you and share some things that I think would be chances, opportunities for people in the communities along the Old Connecticut Path to get involved and bringing this path and the stories that go with it to the community at large and sharing it with those who might want to come here. So I'm going to share with you the evolution of this project of mine that's led to a proposal that I'm going to share with you for a trail, a commemorative trail that follows close to or parallels where necessary the route of the Old Connecticut Path. And let me back up and just, I'm going to move over a little bit here so I work both sides of the room. Little family portrait here. I told you I was tracing my ancestors' footsteps from Cambridge, or Newtown as it was then called, on down to Hartford. After much searching and following and getting lost in the woods here in northeastern Connecticut, I did go down to Hartford and saw there was the story of my ancestors. I am a descendant of Thomas Hooker, and the story I was following was the migration of the Hooker congregation from Cambridge, or Newtown, to Hartford in 1636. This depiction of their trip actually has a place on the state capitol, on the east face of the capitol. And I like to say, after doing a lot of presentations at the historical societies and other groups along the way, that I've come to realize that this story really has a connection with the story of Connecticut. Because here we have a group, or one of the groups, along with the groups that went to Windsor and to Wethersfield in that same time, that founded the Connecticut colony. And in a few short years ahead, in 1633 to 2033 to 2036, there may be some celebration in the state of the 400th anniversary of Connecticut. Now, next year, it's coming fast with 2020, we know that's going to be the 400th anniversary of the arrival of the Mayflower. Well, in a few years beyond that, Connecticut may be thinking about how to celebrate or commemorate the journey that sparked the forming of the colony that became the state of Connecticut. Now, I'd like to tell you that, the story that is written about this journey, Governor Winthrop of Connecticut, of Massachusetts, wrote in his journal that May 30, 1636, Reverend Hooker and most of the congregation from Newtown left for Connecticut, driving 160 cows, and his wife was carried on a horse litter. Not too much detail. The course of history is it's almost like they disappeared into the ethos once they got beyond what is now Route 128 outside of Boston. They just sort of disappeared. There are various stories that came up over time that, there were the views that Thomas Hooker must have walked with a compass in his hand through the wilderness, and somehow they found their way to Connecticut. Now, any of you, I understand there are a few hikers here. Are a few hikers in the room? Any of you do free hiking or just walking in the woods? It's darn easy to get turned around even when you know where you are. If you don't know where you're going, it's very hard to get there. So it's very likely that they were following Native American trails. And Given the relationship with the native people at that time, it's likely that they had some guides to help them find their way from Cambridge on down to Hartford without getting lost, because it's recorded that it likely was about a fortnight, which is around 10 days, 2 weeks. And if you look at the math, it's probably traveling 8 to 10 miles a day. So consider that in 1636 there were no Motel 6, no McDonald's, no rest stops along the way. They were living pretty primitively, eating pretty primitively, kinds of things they might have had on the ships coming over to Massachusetts, dried foods or porridges. They were sleeping on the ground, did not have any shelters to speak of along the way. So it was a hard journey, but they all made it. And I didn't come across any records of anyone on this journey dying. There were a few mishaps on some other journeys, but overall, they made it quite safely. Now, the story is here that Susanna Hooker, who was on the horse litter, I want to dispel something that is a myth. Poor Susanna Hooker, wife of Reverend Thomas Hooker, who gets all the statues down in Hartford. She was just overcome and disabled, and she had to be carried from Cambridge to Connecticut to Hartford. What really is, maybe it comes from the Victorian era when this was portrayed, that somehow she was frail. She had to be quite strong to go from Cambridge to Hartford with 3 children under the age of 6 years. And the youngest being just under 3 years old. So if you can imagine having 3 young children who probably were riding along with her, and they don't depict that there, it sort of changes the picture of the story, the strength of the people, the character that they had to be able to endure this and go on down this trail through the wilderness to find their new home. The other thing I point out here, and I've talked about this story is kind of in the DNA of Connecticut. Well, it's also part of my DNA, because right here, this young girl was 12 years old, and she was walking beside her mother. Her name was Mary Hooker. A few years later, a young man came down who was one of the first students at Harvard. His name was Roger Newton, and he came to study for the ministry in the home of Thomas Hooker. And as I say, the rest of the story, I think 11 generations away from her, is the story of our family and the founding of my family in America. And her job along that way was to help her mother take care of those children. So now if you imagine taking your children, your grandchildren out for a walk and saying, come on kids, let's walk to Connecticut. Let's do the AT from Georgia to Maine. Well, we have some of those kinds of experiences that are really challenging today. But they didn't have things like dehydrated food and little camp stoves or inflatable mattresses and bug nets and anything else. They were truly roughing it along the way. And so their story, and they represent the groups from Dorchester, the Dorchester congregation, led by John Wareham, that came down around the same time period to Windsor. And a group of people that didn't come as a congregation but kind of streamed on down from Watertown to found Wethersfield, all within the same time frame. And from them grew, over time, the enlarged colony of Connecticut from the heart in that Connecticut Valley. And some generations later, and I'm following my own family with all the people that made my family, I come up with the fact that many of those great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren wound up right back in this valley. in Norwich, in the area around Norwich, and down towards Wyndham, that there was a reverse migration that came on down here to take advantage of the land that was available here. So that's my story right in one picture. And you get a sense of, well, if you're trying to figure out your story, the best place to go is to try and figure out where it began. So that's my story, and I'm going to share a little bit about where this has taken me and where it may tie into something that you all can do, hopefully over the coming years, that you'll be able to help bring about. Yeah. I'm going to jump ahead to a time that I came up with over in the Woodstock Historical Society. They had a set of articles on a Boy Scout troop in 1944 that learned about the Connecticut Path from a book called The Great Trail of New England that was written published in 1940, and said, we ought to do this. So the summer of 1944, they met over in Eastford at Camp Nahaco, planned their trip, and then went on down to Boston and walked all the way back to Hartford. And what's great about it is each of the scouts wrote a narrative on each of the days of the trip. So we get a sense of what was this area of Thompson, along with all the other towns, like at that point. And you can imagine how much it's changed. Now in December of 1944, there was an article that was in Boy's Life about their trip. And they were talking about someday it would be their goal to see a commemorative trail along this route. So now 75 years later, I have you all here in the room talking about the possibility of a commemorative trail. And I have to say, I'm going to share with you, I think because of the work of some of the folks here in this room and in the towns along the way who've been involved in conservation groups and land trusts, in trail work, and have the interest in what's happening in their environment and historical connections, that it's possible to envision a trail going across Connecticut from Thompson on down to Hartford. So I'll share some of that with you. And now, was there one single trail? Seems like there were parallel trails. When native trails were able to be observed before they got plowed under or buried under, there were summer trails and winter trails. Summer trails were down in the valleys. Winter trails went across the tops of the hills. What's most likely to have been preserved in some way are the trails that went across the top of the hills. If you think about how your area in Thompson and all the area towns along the way have changed, most of the changes come down in the valleys where the highways have been built, the dams have been built, the factories were put in, that area has been changed. But there's a green space up on the hills in between Center Turnpike and Tolland Turnpike and the Middle Post Road. If you took those as your outer boundaries, within that area we can find trails that fit within the description and the alignment of the Connecticut Path. Now, we wouldn't want to necessarily walk Route 84, which is the north, brings us down close to the North Pack, because that was along the area of the Nipmuc Trail. You'd get pretty much run over on it. And going down Route 44 could be a little chancy if you took a group and said, we're going to walk to Hartford along Route 44. But we could have a much closer experience to the experience of those pioneers going through the woods if we stayed to the highlands across eastern Connecticut. So what I'm proposing from my explorations and some research on the history of the Connecticut Path and the passage of people is a heritage trail that you'll see in the green. It goes across 13 towns. on from Thompson on down to Hartford. And I'll share with you the fact that there's already pieces that are ready to go. And that's where you've played a part, some of you here in the room, and in the other towns along the way. Here it is with a little more detail. And I want to share with you that I was amazed when I came into this part of Connecticut. But I was astounded when I went down to Vernon and went on down the Tankerhusen and the Hockenham Greenway, that there's a trail system there from the Vernon-Tolland line that you can walk on trail right into the center of Hartford. It's already there. There's tremendous amount of protected land owned by the state, towns, and land conservations in Willington and Tolland. There's some places that it's connected, other places that over time could be. And that leads us back to your piece of the earth here in the last Green Valley. And that's where I want to focus tonight, because I think in this area, you as individuals and as members of your trails committees, your conservation commissions, your historical societies, you can make a difference. If you feel that this is important in connecting people with the history and the land itself. One of the key people in helping to find the trail is none other than Ellen Larned of Thompson. And Ellen Larned had a rather illustrious career as I started digging into it. As a founder of the library, and Joe pointed out to me over here that she very likely picked that particular piece of furniture for the Thompson Library. So in a way, she's here with us tonight. And she wrote a book called The History of Windham County. And I found that, for her time, she was the first woman elected to be member of the Connecticut Historical Society, which before that was an all-men's club. So she was a groundsbreaker, and she left us something that is a legacy that helps us to understand the trail. And that, if you haven't seen it, is the ancient map of Windham County that was included tucked into a sleeve in her book, The History of Windham County. Now on the map she shows, here's where she showed, based on the stories she heard, where the Old Connecticut Path traveled. And I point this out to you, and I've asked Joe about this just a few moments ago. If it'd be possible for the Historical Society here in Thompson to get a really good digital image of this map, because it's fascinating to look at in detail, because it doesn't have towns. If you imagine what this was before there were towns and settlements, there would be just land features. So for people to look at, and I'm thinking even for students to look at as they study local history, to say, here's an assignment. Figure out where these places are. Because that would get them outside and taking a look, or looking at maps instead of GPS. But we'll zoom in a little closer, and you can see that Larned had mapped out a route across Thompson, Woodstock, Eastford, and Ashford, and on beyond to the Willimantic River. And this is 1874. So let's zoom in on Thompson. On the left is Larned's segment of the ancient map of Windham County going across Thompson. And you got an image of it going out across the Quinnebog River and up the hill. Doing some exploration and putting this on the map, you can pretty much see, if you're out wandering about, you could pretty closely follow coming in from Dudley, parallel to the old rail grade, and maybe up over Cordes Hill, coming down along Brickyard, crossing Brickyard Road, and down to the Quinnebog River. And it's likely in that area right where Brickyard Road meets Fabian Road, this big field there, is likely to be a fording place. Because before the river was dammed with those flood control dams, when there was real flooding, you can see the channels that were there across the meadow. So when there was high water, it got spread out. When there was lower water, there'd be bars to cross. And if you think about before bridges, that would make it an ideal place to cross. And up into the woods, across Chandler Hill, which now is in the process of being developed as the Bull Hill Preserve by the Wyndham Land Trust. A fabulous wilderness area crossed by the Old Connecticut Path. Now, envisioning this trail, I'm envisioning starting along the Quinnebog River at the Fabian Bridge and following the river down to Brickyard Road, and then picking up the Quinnebog River Trail and then up Bull Hill Road. Now, the reason I'm showing you this is there's a couple of things here. There's certainly in the future the potential for it to connect with the old railroad grade that currently in Dudley they're developing as a rail trail. I know that's been a goal for people for probably a long time to see that become a trail for public use. At some future point, if that became a trail, it would become a connector to the Massachusetts portion of this commemorative trail. The other thing that I'm struck with is that the Bull Hill Preserve, when it's finally completed, along with West Thompson Lake, we have over 3,000 acres of woodland and preserve, which is extraordinary when you think about the size of that area, that you can walk from the Brickyard, where Brickyard Road comes in, over to Bull Hill Road in Woodstock, be totally in the woods. It'd be like 3 miles walking across. So it's a huge area. So there's potential for great access for people to come and explore the woodland and connect with the history of the Connecticut Path here. And this is how I'm envisioning it in a little more detail, and I'll go into the sections here, really following the river and taking advantage of the West Thompson Lakeland that's owned by the Corps of Engineers, where some trails are already existing, and the Bull Hill Road up over the top of the hill. And in the future, taking advantage of that Quinnebog Rail Trail corridor. Now that rail trail, if you remember those scouts in 1944, their record, they talked about coming right down, they walked the railroad tracks down to Fabian. So that is their connection. Now the northern section, you know, is there someone in there, some folks here in the room that fish or hike along that northern section above Brickyard Road? Okay, it's a little rough, but it's an area that, if you look ahead, since it's within public land and it follows a beautiful river, there's potential for developing and having a trail on either side of the river. My feeling is that probably on the west side is to be preferred because there are several access points through the Corps of Engineers land. The far side on the east is a little rougher, but again, if you combine them together, you'd have a 6-mile loop along the river. And the river itself, for those of you who've all been out along the Quinnebog, it's beautiful. And here's the area of the ford where the water flattens out and it's wide. And you can almost see, going back into the 1600s, when they had the salmon and shad runs running up the rivers here. And one of the great discoveries I had along this walk and just stumbled onto was the cascade along Osier Brook, which is only about a 5-minute walk from Brickyard Road. You go there in the spring when the water's rushing down. It's a spectacular falls from the road, from Fabian Road, right down to the Quinnebog River. Now the second half runs from Brickyard Road, following the Quinnebog River Trail and then upward to Bull Hill Road. And this past spring, I was happy to lead a group from the Connecticut AMC along this particular route and introduce them to what was here that they had not explored. You know, they think, got to go elsewhere to get to the wilderness, and they were surprised at what they found as we walked along the river and up over Bull Hill. And to the viewpoint where the old road crossed the Quinnebog River and then goes up to Bull Hill Road, which as I has read, and I believe it was in Larned's book, that belief that this might have been one of the earliest roads leading into Woodstock. So that goes back to 1686 or beyond, or earlier. And to the summit where there's the viewpoint on top of Bull Hill. Now, in my own explorations, you know, the yellow shows a line for approximately of the commemorative trail. The red shows a line approximately of what I came to settle on as the Connecticut Path. And the black lines are kind of feeder roads because this whole area was woodlots. And if any rights of way still exist from other points other than Bull Hill Road, it would open up opportunities for creating loops within the future Bull Hill Preserve, in addition to those which can be experienced from Bull Hill Road. So there's tremendous opportunity here, and I'm excited for the ideas that the work that the Wyndham Land Trust and folks here in Thompson who've been involved in the Land Trust in developing this area as a preserve. Now, Woodstock is a different kind of animal. Woodstock doesn't have these vast tracts of land that are publicly accessible. Most land in Woodstock is private lands, which creates a problem for trying to create a corridor to follow through. So what they do have is a series of historic and scenic roads. Roads that you hope never change because they lead you into another time, into the wilderness of Woodstock. And piecing those together, there is an alternate way to cross Woodstock that would be low traffic, could be accessible for bicyclists and walkers, and bring you into an experience that's close to what might have been for those walking to Connecticut. Now, the three routes that I show, the Larned route is the northern route. The Connecticut Historical Commission, based on the Woodstock Historical Society's records, is the central route. And I'm going to say, if you're going to have a walking path that doesn't have traffic, minimal traffic, that you might be able to bring bikes on, bring families on, and explore, runs a little bit lower towards Quasit, and then out across the corner of Hartford. But before we go there, there's another loop I want to bring in here that also is historically connected to the path, that leads from Bull Hill. The Bull Hill Road is a historic road, and either following Roxbury Road up to the center of Woodstock, and Roxbury Road in town history, Woodstock is regarded as one of the first roads in Woodstock. If you look at it going diagonally up the slope, you can envision where you might want to take a wagon up that way than up the steep part. And coming into Woodstock at Childs Hill, you get a sense of you're in another time in the country. And Roxbury Road is not open today, because they don't plow it in the winter. And that tells you that it's a primitive road as you go up the hill. And it's the kind of place that if you said, I want to get off the beaten path and walk or ride a bike, that would be the place to go. Right up to the center of Woodstock, the Historical Society, and the Green. Now, Woodstock has a real strong connection. Over a century ago, members of the Historical Society were very interested in this connection to the Connecticut Path and collected stories from the residents at that time and developed what they believed was the route across the town and incorporated it into a National Historic District of the Old Connecticut Path. But Woodstock is a gorgeous place to pass through. And you can understand why the Wabequassits had that as a place that was a gathering place for their tribe. And it was also where John Eliot later came to preach to the Wabequassits. And in 1686 at Pulpit Rock, where the first settlers went to have their church services. So it's steeped in the history of the Connecticut Path and the early settlement of Woodstock. Now what I'm suggesting is one of the loops could be going out around Pulpit Rock and coming back to the Heritage Trail. And I'll break that down in just a little bit here. Get this to work. There we go. Would pass from the center of town, Pulpit Rock, Rappaport Spalding, and then on to Quarry Hill after crossing Rocky Hill Road. And for those on bike, it could be about a 10-12 mile circuit. Very nice ride on very quiet roads. Passing Pulpit Rock and Pulpit Rock Road. I just was in a meeting down at the last Green Valley, and I said, you know, there are 5 seasons down this part of the country. There's winter, spring, summer, and fall, and then there's mud season. Pulpit Rock Road is one of the members of mud season. But it does lead, when I talk about Ellen Larned and her contribution, if you follow Ellen Larned's map and you look at the landforms, the Wyndham Land Trust Rappaport Spalding Preserve is right on the path. And it's a wonderful place to walk and explore and get that sense of quiet of the wilderness. And then continue on down to what I'm proposing with the green line is a quiet road that would be, if you're walking, you walk. If you chose to ride a bike, maybe not a skinny tire bike, but one of those fat tire bikes, or maybe an e-bike, you'd be able to do without fear of being run down. The other thing I'm showing you this is that Woodstock doesn't have that big piece of land that's publicly accessible. But if you look here, we're traveling through a big green space that hasn't been developed along Quarry Road. So our path from Woodstock on down to Eastford is about 7.5 miles. It's about the straightest line, believe it or not, shortest distance to travel over to Eastford. And going up New Sweden Road, it's about that wide. 2 cars meet, you better slow down. You wave, you pull over. And Quarry Road is another animal entirely. You could not go on Quarry Road now because you have to wait for ice to be out. It's not maintained, and this is about as good as it gets. So you can see walking or bicycling with a good solid bike with fat tires, you're in the wilderness. And I came across in my research here, I'll share it with you. I wasn't quite sure what to do with it until I went to Quarry Road and saw it, that Captain Sabin was one of the proprietors or founders of Hartford. So that would put him there around 1700. And he related a story about 1806. It was written down that about 40 years ago, he was cutting an oak tree, and he noticed as he cutting into it that there was a section that had been chipped and marked. And Quarry felt that natives wouldn't have done that. They knew where they were. They weren't lost. That it may well have been a marker of a trail. And when he counted the rings from where the mark was out to the bark, it corresponded about to the years of the past before that, when the pioneers went down to Connecticut in the 1630s. So it suggests that in northern Hartford, along the Woodstock line, which is right where Quarry Road is, and there's enough obstruction south of Quarry Road with marshes and bogs to make it difficult to go there, that it's likely that there was a path or trail there. And further along that line, when you get up to the end of Quarry Road, there used to be a road that went right down the hill. It's now closed. So if we project it across, it could well have gone right to Crystal Pond, which we'll be hearing about, where the Connecticut Path also came. So my projection is to come down and go right through Eastford, down along Swedentown Road, which is again a dead-end road, and down Summer Hill, which if you're on a bike would be a great coast, into Old Colony Road. Now, those of you who would be on a bike, if there's anyone here who gets an e-bike, I'm thinking of one of those, be a little harder pedaling, but a circuit of about 13 miles, you could go out and then back across Rocky Hill Road and back along the Pulpit Rock Road and pass the Rocky Hill Preserve. It's great country, and it's in line with what Woodstock and the Connecticut Historical Society identified as aligned with the Connecticut Path. But the road is busier. And the reason I didn't select that to be the commemorative trail is the road has higher speed traffic. Crossing into Eastford, a little bit of a turn because we want to get to Camp Nahako. Now, the map of ancient Windham County, the Old Connecticut Path, as the Woodstock folks would have in the Connecticut Historical Society, converge right at Crystal Pond. To connect with Crystal Pond, short walk up from Eastford Center on one lane, two lane, very narrow road, 2 lane, to dirt road to Camp Nahako, which is a Eastford Woodstock preserve. The towns of Eastford and Woodstock jointly own and preserve that property at Camp Nahako. And from Camp Nahako, until a connection is made, a better connection is made, is to go down and follow the Natchog Trail on to Ashford. So those of you who've been out on the Natchog Trail, you'll know in a few minutes where that all fits together. One of the things, you go into Eastford, right in the center of town, they have the historic marker, and within the second line, first line ancient Nipmuc territory, second line Connecticut Path. So it's been recognized in Eastford that this is a significant part of their heritage and their history. I've had the pleasure of speaking with their Historical Society and Conservation Commission. Town of Eastford, if we took this room and divided it, I think maybe half would be giving it a big room. Is their town meeting room. On Wednesday night like this, 75 people showed up, standing and crammed in, and it was in March. So it wasn't easy, the mud season was setting in. Because they're interested in the Connecticut Path. And they have an interest particularly at Camp Nahako, as I said, those Boy Scouts in 1944, that's where they met to plan their trip. And on the way back, that's where they met and talked, presented to the scouts that were there. And in 1974, another group of scouts did the same thing. So the Boy Scouts and the Britain Council have a connection with those people. I heard from someone who said he had a picture of the group that was in 1944. Didn't get a copy of it, but I had to figure that by their ages, they'd be well into their 90s now. But their plan was that there'd be some like a commemorative trail. And as you look here in Camp Nahako, is a beautiful spot if you get it just right. And looking out across Crystal Pond to the west in the direction of the Old Connecticut Path going west. Now, one of the things that, and I want to bring this to the attention of the Historical Society folks here, that is happening in Eastford. There are a couple things. That they've incorporated this into their local history studies in the Eastford School. So when they do their local history field trips, they go to Camp Nahako, and they get a little unit on the pioneers traveling along the Old Connecticut Path and camping along the lake there at Crystal Pond. Zooming ahead, the Camp Nahako Commission from representatives from Eastford and Woodstock are right now in the process of putting together interpretive signs to explain the history of the path, the history of the woodland there, and the history of the park along the trails so that others can come and experience it and make a connection by walking in the woods. And I think that for those of you in the Historical Society, you say, well, how do we make things connect with younger people, with history? This is a marvelous way of getting kids out and walking and experiencing the woodland and getting a lesson in history. What could be better? And for those of you, there may have been some who came out for Walktober, very popular. A few years ago, we did a walk there, and like 75 people came out to walk in the woods with us and have a program. We talked. We didn't have slides, we had the woods. We didn't need slides. But to get that experience of walking in the woods, on trails like this where they will be putting up those interpretive markers for those who come and want to walk more quietly in the woods on their own. Eastford had a resident, David Chisholm. He was in Eastford and Ashford families across the line there. And he transferred the map from Ellen Larned's map onto a more recent map. It was, more recent was what it was like in like 1860. So you could see who was living in different places, one of those street atlases, which helps you kind of pin down where, a little more precisely where the path was. And one of the places that you can go today, if you've been to Buell Orchard and you walked and you picked apples, you've been either on or darn close to the Old Connecticut Path, because it goes right across the orchard. There's another side story with the Buell family. I'm doing this family history project of my own. I found out I have a bunch of cousins, and their names are Buell. One of my ancestors out there was William Buell. And William came over in the early 1630s. He may have come with the first group from Dorchester, England. And he may have traveled with John Wareham with the first group or one of the follow-on groups on down to found Windsor. And about a century to a century and a half, 150 years later, his descendants wound up back in the Quinnebog River Valley. And then about, well, let's say 130 years ago, I guess they're saying since 1889, so 130 years ago, one of their descendants wound up starting an orchard right on the path that his ancestor may have traveled across. So if you go to Buell Orchard and get the pie and your apples, you can stop and look around and say, this is where the path crossed. Another spot in Eastford that I highly recommend taking groups there 4 or 5 times, the groups down there. So if you want to have an easy walk for yourself or with a small group or a big group, go on up to Bigelow Brook Farm on Westford Road, because it's in Eastford. And right across from that is Walker Road. And Walker Road is a state-owned right-of-way to lead you into Yale Forest and up to these stones on Bigelow Brook that tradition has were placed, these large boulders like that, placed in a road as the foot-stepping stones across the Bigelow Brook before there was a bridge, when it was still a trail. And it's right where Larned's line would have crossed. So it's a lovely road to walk in and into Yale Forest and Natchog Forest and go down the Bigelow Brook. And the groups that I brought in there, we delight in just the quiet in the woods. We have a moment of it as a former school site up there. And we go into class and stop, and they say, okay, class, let's just be quiet for a moment. And there's a place, believe it or not, when the planes aren't flying, and you have to work it right. They aren't headed for Bradley. There are moments when all you hear is the sound of the wind blowing through the trees and the birds. Incredibly beautiful place that is off the path, off the beaten path, but it's on the Connecticut Path. Now there's the Old Connecticut Path as Larned had it, and the green down below shows a workaround using the Natchog Trail from Eastford to get into Westford or to Ashford. But there is a chunk of land here that is state forest that you can see there's actually a road running through it from Ashford Road on down to Colby or no, can't read it from here. And it's all through state forest. So there's a potential, as you see it extending east, that this is Camp Nahaco and this is state land for the road. And who owns the land in between is the current owners of Buell Orchard, who were descended before Buell. So perhaps someday in the future they may grant an easy, allow a trail to cross, which would enable a more direct route, excuse me, out along Walker Road to the Bigelow Brook crossing and rejoin the Old Connecticut Path into Ashford. But until that time, there's another possibility. And those of you who are the woods walkers, I invite you to go out. You can see this connection of the lanes that are public lanes. But it opens up the potential for a 6-mile loop in the wilderness in Eastford and Ashford. If you think about it, instead of doing out and back kind of walks that you're used to, having a circuit walk, bringing you to a spot that's very special along the Connecticut Path. The other thing I've been talking about, and I haven't emphasized enough, is that there's a great potential for a meeting, drawing in those who may want to go by bike and get on quiet roads. I pointed out the Quarry Road possibility for those who wanted something a little sporty, or even over Bull Hill. Between Eastford and Westford, there's a network of roads that form an almost infinite loop, set of loops that you could ride that have very low traffic and don't have extreme hills. And you're in the wilderness for the most part. It's mostly woodland. So you have an opportunity to help people discover the land here, both by walking and riding, and even those folks who just want to get out and drive through it. I'm going to bring you up to the close here before we hit the questions and comments. Ashford is terrific. Thompson is really good because you've got some great things going there. You heard me up front. I've done presentations up in Dudley, and they were impressed with the fact that they were doing work on the rail trail and some of the conservation lands that fit right along the corridor. You carry it east from Ellen Larned's map. But Ashford is in a sort of category by itself. Again, this is the updated version from the Chisholm map of the Old Connecticut Path from Ellen Larned across Ashford. And one of the things that Ellen Larned had in her history of Windham County was that tradition reports their encampment there, meaning the Hooker congregation, was on Pine Hill in Ashford. And with much looking around, figured out where Pine Hill is that was being referred to. And the Connecticut Historical Commission also figured out where it was based on deeds and very old maps, survey maps. And they said the abandoned road that you see is again the most likely candidate for the Connecticut Path. This is on private land, so I took a sneak peek. wasn't posted, so I didn't feel like I was really being intrusive, and there were no houses. But I can tell you that if you are riding on Eastford Road in Westford by Axe Factory, it's on top of the hill to the north of the road. And it continues on down into, the trail continues on down onto the Nipmuc Path, which I'll show you in a moment. So this is the proposed trail taking advantage of the Natchog and the Nipmuc trails across Ashford, something that's already there. And as you see right here, I didn't put them on top of each other. Up here is that ancient road. Down here, it comes down along the ridge and just follows the contours down to the brook. And it also coincides with the Nipmuc Path. So those of you who may have walked that section on the Nipmuc Path, you've also walked on the Connecticut Path. Out to the west, past Westford Hill, we do have to come out for a short distance on Perry Hill and Amadon Road before going into Billington. So primarily on trail, off-road. The last segment that you do on road is, again, those very quiet country roads, not developed, very low speed. So now I said, if you're on the Natchog and the Nipmuc Trail, right where they meet, and you see that sign, you've come to the spot where the Old Connecticut Path crossed. And taking a walk with a group from Connecticut Trails Day, we led a group down there. Someone had put up a sign that said, this trail's been in use for 400 years. And we're quite proud of the fact that it was identified as the Old Connecticut Path, the native trail. Now, one of the things that I have been searching for, and I'm going to share it with you, it hasn't been seen anywhere else. I did show it down last Green Valley earlier. For those of you who are woodland explorers, going back, this is 1945, so almost 75 years ago. The dotted line was a road, and I found, had shared with me that that road really was a road back in 1830. Now it's fallen off the map. But one of the things that intrigued me, and I had to check it out, is taking a look at how that might fit with something that would lead people into the woods in a circuit walk. And I went out, and it's pretty degraded after 75 years. But that road still can be found and followed if you look very carefully at the routes. And you can follow it up to the Yale Forest. It kind of falls apart. But if you follow the boundary between Yale Forest and the State Forest as your trail markers, within a quarter of a mile you're on the Natchog Trail. And so what this creates, if you start, as many people do, down on Iron Mine Road and follow it out and take the proposed loop or connector, you wind up with a little over a 4-mile circuit that brings you around and on the Connecticut Path, brings you down across the ridges and the woodland, the portion that's part of the Nipmuc Marathon, down to Pixie Falls and back. And I talked with folks and they said, you know, when we go, we either have to bring a car, you know, and meet up with people and put a car at one end and at the other end and meet up that way, or we have to just walk out and walk back. You know, imagine, this is something that some folks are exploring, if there could be a circuit walk. And it's connected with the Connecticut Path that, I'm going to go back. The only place that you would see a house would be this section right here. From there on, all the way around, there's no sign or sign of any houses. You're in the woods. Now imagine a 4-mile walk in the woods. Consider that those people who came down in 1636 in that time frame, they were doing 8-10 miles a day on foot. So imagine you go out and you say, come on kids, let's take a walk. I'm going to take you for a walk. It's only 4 miles. They're going to discover what hardship is in being in an area with no cell reception. If you take them around the second time to 8 miles, they're going to discover what the pioneers did and what my ancestor Mary did walking beside her mother through the wilderness. Because there you're going to have, as close as we can construct today, a wilderness experience that would capture what they walked through. Now we have a connection where we bring us to the end at a park, the Fenton Ruby Park, across the border in Willington. And Amadon Road ends at the Willington town line. It's a public road. But on the other side of the line, it goes right into the Fenton Ruby Park. And it comes down and merges with the road that Larned and the Connecticut Historical Commission and myself independently, I have to confess to the fact that I read the Connecticut Historic Report after I'd done my research and field work. I was kind of scared when I read it because I figured if I find out I'm really all wrong, I'm going to feel pretty foolish, but most of it just matched up. And so we were all in agreement. So I thought they were very intelligent with their solutions. But that trail comes down and it matches up with and follows through Fenton Ruby along the Old Connecticut Path. And Fenton Ruby is a jewel out there. It's only like 5 miles off of 84 and you're in another world. And the trails there are fun to walk around the pond and up that road in the upper corner there is the passage of the Old Connecticut Path as it is now. Now I want to give credit to the folks, the Conservation Commission folks in Ashford. I've come out in all my presentations to the historical societies. It's been really a collaboration because the historical societies, the conservation commissions, and the library people are the ones that put it together in their towns. And they're also the ones who are out doing things in the community. And those folks on the Conservation Commission, many are also on the Historical Society, they set out on a tract of land, the Langhammer property, to build a circuit walk through the Langhammer woods and to connect it, put in a connector trail to the trail system at Ruby Fenton. So you have this beautiful walkway, here's the commission, and scenes from that circuit walk on the Langhammer property, right off of the Old Connecticut Path. So you have many startlingly beautiful woodland areas that have been preserved by the towns, the land trusts, the state, conservation groups, Yale Forest. You have those all along this route. What I'm proposing with this heritage trail is simply to connect them. Find a way to connect them across the distance of these 4 towns, and then on beyond Willington, on down to Hartford. And the question always comes up, and this is, if you build it, will they come? Well, I'd have to say that, thanks to the Last Green Valley and the Connecticut Trails Day and other groups that I've worked with that we've done walks, people come out to walk on the Connecticut Path. And they come to walk and get a sense of the story and to connect with the land and the people who came through. So if you build it, I think they will come. And they'll come for a variety of reasons. And they're going to come from all over. Because the people who were connected with that first passage, that first westward migration in 1630s, their children, their descendants, didn't sit still when they got to the Connecticut Valley. Within a few generations, they were heading north to the wilderness of New Connecticut, which is now Vermont. They were heading west up the Hudson River Valley, and they didn't stop there. They continued across to the Midwest, across the back, up Nebraska, up the Platte River, and they continued in this part of America's westward migration. So you could say it kind of started here. So their descendants today are now all over the U.S. And I've had the pleasure to hear from a number of them saying they want to come and visit and see where their ancestors came from and experience a piece of what they experienced. So I'm asking you to help take the vision of the history, the story that you have here in Thompson, the land that you've worked to open and create trails to bring people out, to show children, to open up to people who are foreigners coming in, to think about your place in being able to connect that story that Thompson has a piece of with the towns along the way between now and Connecticut's 400th anniversary. I'm not saying doing it overnight, because those of you who've been involved in conservation and trail work and all the other committees and groups you work on, nothing happens right away. But it happens if there's someone out there who's persistent and willing to work the small stuff to make it happen. And here's the group. Here's a group that did it from Windsor. They did it in 1983 for the 275th anniversary of, 250th anniversary of Windsor's founding. They walked from Dorchester to Windsor. I didn't catch it in there. One of them walked barefoot. I'm not sure why. But if you have to imagine that, what better, more fitting way to commemorate a historic event that's connected with where you live, where your families have grown, where your ancestors come from, than a trail that gives them some of that experience and helps them to connect in real ways with the land, the people that came, and their own personal stories. Oops, I went backwards there. So that brings me to the end of my story, and I think I've done it just about within time. And it allows for you folks, when we turn on the lights, to rub your eyes. And I'd love to hear what your response and any questions that you might have on where this might go and how you might be able to play a part in this process. So thank you, and Joe, if you turn on the lights. For more information, visit the Old Connecticut Path website. Follow the Old Connecticut Path on Facebook.